Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Making Milestone Podcast. I'm so sorry for the delay in getting episodes up. There's been a lot of busy stuff going on, and I've had a lot of cool projects in the works that I'm really excited to share with you. One of which is my latest podcast, which is the sister podcast to this one called the Main Character Energy Podcast. And for anyone who's looking for horsey content that's also mixed in with lifestyle and dating content, that is the place to go. It's going to be a little bit more casual than this one and less information heavy, whereas the Making Milestone podcast is still going to stay prioritizing discussions about horse welfare, horse training, and all of that jazz and have it be more information based. So if you're interested in checking out that podcast, it's co-hosted by my good friend Danny, and I'm really excited to share it with you. We've already uploaded 2 episodes and it's really great. The next couple of episodes that will be coming out, I'm also really excited about as we get more comfortable being on air together. But anyways, today's episode is also a very exciting one. I had the pleasure of talking to the owner of Dressage Hub, who many of you probably know because her presence online and her advocacy for horses, specifically in the dressage ring, but also beyond that. So without further ado, we're just going to jump into that conversation, and I'm so excited to have her on the podcast.
I'm Susan Wachowicz. I am the founder of Dressage Hub and the founder of the World Equestrian Federation. I originally founded Dressage Hub as the way to bridge the gap between education in Wellington and the upper elite and the rest of the world. And what I realized was there was not a need for the bridge for the gap. There was a need for people to hear the story of what was really happening in the elite. So I kind of shifted and pivoted into a platform that talks about animal welfare issues and the use case for horses in sport and how to improve upon the lives of horses that are in elite sport.
Perfect. Yeah, and that platform has made you quite controversial in the horse community. I've watched you for years and I support your work, but you tend to attract a fair amount of crazies into your comment section through what you're sharing. Because I would say out of anyone that I've personally seen, you cover a lot of stuff that a lot of people are not willing to cover.
Yeah, absolutely. I say the things that people aren't ready to hear and the things that people aren't really sort of willing to touch yet. And I make it acceptable, right? It's kind of been a wild ride in terms of that and being in a place. I was met with controversy even when I posted only educational videos. So it was easier for me to make that transition because I was like, if I'm going to be met with this much controversy, I might as well tell the truth about what's really happening behind the scenes, and people need to see it and hear it. And I often said people aren't ready to hear what's really happening yet. And so it's been an evolution of slowly inching my way and saying, okay, well, if you think that's crazy, this is also happening. And it's like another jaw dropper and another layer of jaw. And we haven't even fully exposed all of the things that are happening. But I think if you do too much of it at once, people are just so overwhelmed with all of it. It's too much. So we just keep peeling back another layer and peeling back another layer. And I've built like a loyal fan base that now kind of helps me combat some of the crazy. Because for the longest time, I feel like it was me against a lot of crazy. And so I think I'm in a much better place now where it feels like a movement rather than just like me against the world.
Yeah, you running like a one-man army because I can relate to that feeling as well. Like I definitely am not in the know to the extent you are with like hearing about the individual. Because do you live down in Florida then by
Yes.
okay. And then you can go there in person and see what's going on too.
Yeah. So I was immersed in Wellington. I came down here in 2012 with my upcoming Grand Prix horse that I'd imported from Holland. And I was like, yeah, let's do it. I was sold the dream. I was sold the dream that everybody is sold. And I came to Wellington shiny and happy. I packed my suitcase. I did the things that everybody said you're supposed to do to get to the top. And it wasn't that. It wasn't even close to that. It was like, how much are you willing to sacrifice in so many ways? It wasn't like an athlete making sacrifices. It's like, how much of your soul are you willing to sacrifice to get to the top? And so I brought him down here in 2012, rode and did the things, and then realized that like this wasn't for me. So continued with Dressage Hub, thought what I was going to take was a sabbatical, but I'm happier not riding for the moment and just sort of positioning myself in a place where I don't have to be accountable for everything I say on the internet. Because if I say something and some trainer's mad at me and they don't want it in their barn, or I don't want to be silenced by the politics of the industry. So for me, not riding at this point has been a better way to position myself to have the freedom to say the things that need to be said.
100%. But I'm guessing, like, because I get this too, where if you're not riding, people will try to use that as a means of discrediting the things that you do say, even though it doesn't really have anything to do with whether or not you're able to notice stuff. Because I've found one of the common excuses when you criticize the upper levels is, let's see you ride at that level, or you're not competing. And it's a really flimsy argument if people actually want to break it down, but usually the people saying it aren't ready to like reflect on the flaws in logic that they're using to try to shut down any discussion.
It's one of my favorite arguments, actually, because most of the people, by their logic, most of the people can't criticize me because they haven't ridden at as high a level as I have. So I trained my own young rider's horse. It was a 3-year-old thoroughbred off track. I made a better scheme back in the day on that horse that I trained solely by myself, didn't ship it away to training. Most young riders, as you know, buy their horses and make a team. So that in and itself is an accomplishment that nobody's ever going to be able to take away from me. And then same thing with my Grand Prix horse. I didn't ship it away to training. I bought it as a 3-year-old, imported it, and developed it to the point where I could take it to Wellington and see what potential it had. So I love it when they say that, because I'm an amateur. Truly, I'm an amateur rider. But I've ridden to the Grand Prix. I've trained my own horses to the Grand Prix, and I'm happy. I don't need to defend that in my knowledge. I'm sharing my knowledge, and you know this because it's not even an argument, but it's one of my favorite arguments that people come at me with, because I'm confident in what I've done and what I've accomplished, and I've gone as far as I can go and answer the question ethically.
Oh, for
because
sure.
any further, if I go there, I have to destroy a horse. And I'm not willing to do that.
For sure. So I guess the next question I think a lot of people would be dying to know is, like, what do you feel are some of the most pressing issues that you want to see? Like, if you could choose certain issues to solve first based off of what you're seeing, what would they be?
I think the biggest shift we need to see is action from the FEI. I think, one, there's no accountability for the judges. We saw this earlier this season with Janet Foy and the judging fiasco. She just made up some rules. And there's no checks and balances for the judges. And the FEI doesn't really hold them accountable to a standard. So like whether that's a third party, something or other that oversees it, I don't know what that looks like. But the judges are relatively unchecked in all of this. And they're sitting in the VIP tents and they're just schmoozing. So they don't care. They're doing what's best for their own interest. So I think that's one of the key pieces. And then the FEI needs to start implementing the rules and standing by them, which we've started to see a shift towards that in the last 12 months. With a lot of these abuse videos coming out, they're actually taking a stand, suspending riders. And that's the first time we're actually seeing some of that stuff. But everything down to the fluff, the nose bands. I mean, all of these riders would be eliminated for so many reasons if they just followed the simple rules. So I think that's collectively the biggest frustration, is we keep getting more and more committees to look at things and from a welfare perspective, but we're not seeing any action. And I think that's the biggest frustration for everybody, is that there needs to be some semblance of action somewhere. And we're just not seeing that anywhere. So I think those are the two key pieces that need to shift quickly.
For sure. And also regarding you mentioning marshmallow fluff, I actually learned about that through your content, because for years I've wondered how the foam on their mouths was so purely white, because I was like, are they just taking their hay away for like hours and hours before competition? But even then it would be stark white. And then when I saw your post about that, I was like, okay, that makes sense. But that is crazy that they're doing that. So yeah, there's all sorts of weird little things that people do to maintain an image in the competition ring. And that was one of the ones that was more like obscure, I guess, where I didn't think about it. Like I'd thought about how odd it was, the coloration of the foam, but I didn't consider that they would actually go to the lengths of buying a jar of marshmallow fluff to like put on their horse's mouth.
Yeah, and I get it from like an aesthetic perspective of like, you want to take a cool photo and you want it to make it look pretty. You know, it's like the you see the quarter horses, they put all the makeup on their horse's face. Like, I get it from that perspective. But the extreme side of it, we're seeing it cover up. We're seeing horses with mouths with lacerations and deformed tongues. That's what it's really covering up. And I think the people who are like, it's just fluff, it's no big deal, are the people that see it as the aesthetic side of things, but they're forgetting that there's this other side that it's horrific, that what it's covering up. And so I was met with so much hate over fluff. Like, that was the first big, big controversy. And I was like, but they're all doing it. And I was met with so much hate. And then a year later, Euro Dressage actually came out and did like a close-up photos and article on fluff. And it kind of justified and validated it, which was great for me. But it was so funny how people were so mad about the fluff when it was just such a simple, like, hey, yeah, they have fluff. So it's definitely been an interesting journey in terms of people absorbing information.
Yeah, like that one was one that I can kind of see where people are coming from with like being like shocked by it, but being angry about it. Like, if you look at the photos, it does make sense because there's not a world in which horses produce pure bright white snow-colored foam, especially that many horses, because I can't imagine that all of them are having any food or anything pulled for hours. Like, and even then, I don't think it would be that color because saliva wouldn't produce that color. So it makes sense, but I can see why people are having a hard time believing it because it's a small thing, but it kind of exposes a certain level of corruption and like desire to cover things up and like smoke and mirrors that kind of leads people to be like, wow, this world is pretty crazy. It's almost like a beauty pageant type.
Yeah, it's such a small thing. And that was when I first, like I said, it was such a small thing for me to come out with it in the first place. And I was met with so much anger and hate. And it was surprised me because I was like, this is barely scratching the surface of what's happening in Wellington, right? Like, if you're not ready to hear this, you're not ready to hear the next 100 things that we really need to talk about. And so, yeah, it's funny how the evolution of that happened, and even with the rule changes with the FEI, we're still seeing fluff on all the horses, right? Astrid from Euro Dressage did an article this week. She's in Wellington. She said all the horses have fluff, nothing has changed, right? And so again, it goes back to the FEI and their rules. Like, yeah, they say, no, we don't want this anymore, but who's going to enforce them?
Do you find that there's like a concerted effort on the part of the FEI and the judges where certain riders are more untouchable than others and they don't have to abide by the rules to the same extent? Or is it just kind of everyone gets away with the same things?
Oh, it's 100% bias. It's 100% bias. I mean, I watched it in Wellington. They always say when you're a rider, you should go watch the warm-up. And I spent hundreds of hours watching the warm-up, but it also means you watch the outgate and you watch the tack check and you watch these riders come out. And there's so many of them that should have been eliminated for either blood or fluff. Fluff was legal at the time, but if you're a certain rider, you know full well that they're not going to eliminate you because the money is more important and the show is more important and the show management is standing there to ensure that that happens and everything runs smoothly. So, it's definitely a bias, right? I don't know that we're going to see a change to that because the FEI is so infiltrated with a lot of money.
Yeah, it's very like elitist culture. And then I'm guessing this next question I was going to ask, but I'm guessing it's probably a similar answer, is that with the actual judging, once they're in the arena competing, do you think that certain people who ride poorer tests are awarded higher marks if they have the right name behind it, be it because of who they are or who they train with?
Absolutely. Absolutely. One of my biggest frustrations was I get that I was sick last week and it took me a minute to watch the Adrian Lyle freestyle. But I watched it several times trying to figure out where an 80% came from. And all I can think of is that they're giving her an 80% so that when she goes to the World Cup, those judges who aren't in the fold of Wellington are more willing to give her a higher score while she's there. Because the horse, that horse is so tight and it's so incorrect on so many levels. And I just don't know where an 80%, even her technical score was a 77% with the degree of difficulty. And that horse is never scoring over 72% in the Grand Prix. So where are the marks coming from? And I watched it over and over and I was like, 100%, when you're the chosen one, like a Lottie Fry or an Adrian Lyle, when you're in that circle, there is a definite bonus points that are allocated. right? I mean, I was talking to someone who had a one-on-one with Janet Foy. She asked her questions, and Janet Foy basically admitted that she would never score Charlotte Dujardin down. So,
Oh, wow.
yeah, basically full out admitted it. So other things that they do in terms of the scoring, like that, if the horse is basically going lame and set to retire, they'll drop the score down to like, you know, maybe a few percent less of what it was scoring when it was at the top of its game, but they'll never just score to 50% and say, it's time for you to retire this horse. So a good example of that was Jackie Brooks on her horse Goose. The horse was basically lame coming down center line, and she's still in there every Friday night doing a freestyle. And I made a video about it, and people are like, well, it's still getting a good score. And I'm like, yeah, because it's an Olympic caliber horse, and the judges they'll never just be like, shame her and get her out of there. They'll just respectfully kind of give her the ability to retire that horse with decent scores. And so those kinds of things, like when you know in the circles that they're happening, it becomes less and less easy to really have faith in the system of judging and being able to compete.
Oh, for sure. That's awful. Especially the retirement thing is like so bad. And then it sucks for the riders because like I grew up without having money to have access to horses, and you have people everywhere be like, if you work hard enough, you'll be able to make it and you'll get opportunities, you'll be given these things and you can get there. And it might be true to an extent, but if it's something where there's subjective marks, like in the dressage ring, you could work really, really hard, but if you don't have the right name behind you, even if you put in a really beautiful test, you could be getting outscored by someone who is more in the know with the it crowd, and that kind of sour if you can even get there in the first place because of the amount of money involved. Because that's the other big thing is I think that there is a lot of gatekeeping in the horse community as a whole that prevents riders who would be dedicated, ethical, and driven from getting there because they simply just don't have the financial capacity.
Absolutely. I think what we're seeing at the top is not the most talented riders. It's the most affluent riders who are willing to play the system. So when I went to Wellington, here's my summary of how I felt after I sold my horse. I was like, it's 1/3 talent, 1/3 politics, and 1/3 money.
Wow.
And that's really what it takes. And if you don't have any one of those three, forget it. There's nothing about working hard. You can work as hard as you want. You can sacrifice your soul. You can go bankrupt trying to get in there. But at the end of the day, even if you have the best, most talented horse without the politics, you will never be at the top of the sport.
Yeah, and it makes it hard too to change the paradigm too, because then if there's riders who would do things differently and who would set a better example, if they're never the ones that are getting platformed, how are they supposed to make a culture shift?
Absolutely. I think that's like the most astounding part is that you've got this place where I think the sport is ultimately going to have to shift between sort of the elites and the people who want to do it correctly because of that exact reason, is that there's no way what's playing in the elite and the affluent part at the top of dressage right now is not the people who want to ride well and correct.
Yeah, they just want to win at any cost. And I find that, yeah, watching people like that, it's kind of interesting to see because you can see that their morals are corrupted. Even if they do in their own way love their horses, there's a limit to what they're willing to do and what they're willing to sacrifice personally. If it means like taking time out of the competition ring or having to slow down and not bring the horse up the levels as much. They don't want to make those sacrifices and they're willing to continue pushing just to get in the arena. And I think that kind of is what separates them from being like true riders, like with correct horsemanship, because it really shouldn't just be about getting in the arena at any cost. And it feels like we've lost that in a lot of disciplines, dressage included. Like for me, from a behavioral perspective, like with my study of behavior and operating as a behavior consultant, I would say that dressage as a discipline, I see the most conflict behaviors in and the most stress behaviors in terms of the Olympic disciplines. But show jumping is pretty close. However, dressage I find to be the most interesting one to have such a high display of stress because harmony and relaxation are supposed to be key judging points. So in theory, we should be seeing substantially less, because on a show jumper, you can go running around and careening around the fences and your horse can be stressed and it's not going to influence your mark because it's a speed event. But with dressage, it's so interesting to me that it has lost such a focus on the relaxation, where so many of these horses look like they're bottled up dynamite that's ready to just like explode in the middle of the arena. And people are kind of shrugging it off as these are upper level, high caliber horses. That's just the way they are.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing less and less skill from the riders at the top. We're seeing more water skiing and less refined ability to feel what's happening under them. We're starting to see more riders fall off, that more than ever before. I mean, the argument before helmets was that dressage riders never fall off, and we're seeing more and more of these riders fall off. One, because the horses are so trigger stacked coming into the ring, and two, because they have no feel. Like, they're not connected to their horses at all. They are jammed into a improperly fitted saddle. They're just locked into the thigh rolls and water skiing on their face and hoping for the best. But I think what people are really missing in terms of the trigger stacking is they're not trigger stacked because it's an exciting environment. They're trigger stacked because they've, one, beat the crap out of them in the warm-up. And I know that during COVID and when there was no audiences for the warm-up, it was really bad and I was getting so many reports of it, but everyone was afraid to film because it's really obvious when there's no crowd who's filming. So they're beating the shit out of them in the warm-up, but they're also doing that at home so that when they get to the warm-up and the horse gets those signals, they're fired up and they want them like that. They want to be able to water ski on their hands, right? They want that big flashy movement. And so we've lost everything that dressage would and should be at the top because we've trigger stacked the horses so badly and the riders have no feel anymore.
Yeah, and that's really, it's sad. And it also, it does that feeds into, I guess, the whole elitist component of it, where if you can buy a horse that's talented and like tolerant enough of that abuse, you can just go in there and if you have the name, and people will reward you for it. But are there riders that you would say are like ones to watch in terms of ones that you think are putting on putting out better tests, whether or not that's being recognized by the judges? Are there riders that are kind of like giving you hope for the state of dressage?
This is a really tricky question. I get this a lot and I refuse to answer it. I don't think that there is a rider at the top who's not pushing the limits of abuse with their horses.
Okay, yeah, that I feel the same way when people ask me that, where it's like, even if I sit and watch all of the tests, like during the Olympics was a great example, where it's like these riders have been hand selected to be the best for their country, and there was a few rides that I liked, but overwhelmingly it was just really disappointing because you see so much of the same stuff being repeated, and it's hard to pick what the best examples are in like a industry that's so corrupt. But I find that people will be like, oh, that's so negative. But I think it's also part of honestly recognizing how bad things have gotten in competitive horse sports, that it's hard to find these good examples.
I agree. I think in the last 10 years specifically, yeah, I would say the last 10 years, it's gotten so bad because I think more and more people are learning about the tricks and the tools and the things to make the shortcuts. And it's just become the mainstream. And so I think even 10 years ago, you could see the difference between a horse like a Totalis and one that wasn't so trigger stacked. And now they're just all so trigger stacked. And I think Morton Thompson has a big influence on that. I don't know what his connection is to everybody, but everybody at the top seems to work with him. Like, he's in there with almost everybody's training program. And so there's some sort of connection within there that I haven't been able to sort of figure out yet. But I think he's the one who's known for his circus tricks and his systems. And so I think that's where that's coming from, is that information is being shared through him and his results. So I think as long as that's the direction everyone is going, I think we're not going to see a big change unless we see it from the FEI or the judges, which we're never going to see it from the judges. So it has to come from the org.
I find it interesting too, because I've had people reference to me, like with regards to the issues with hyperflexion and having like overbent horses, they'll be like, the FEI banned roll cur like however many years ago. And they'll use that as like the talking point to be like, see, this isn't an issue. They're taking it seriously. And I find it interesting because the FEI will make statements sometimes that are about welfare, but if there's a lack of enforcement with what you're saying and there's lack of judging, taking that into account, it doesn't really matter what they say isn't allowed if it's still obviously happening. And it's really easy to see that hyperflexion is still happening because it's winning in the competition ring. It's not even just in the warm-ups.
Yeah, I mean, it's blatantly obvious to everybody who's seeing it. I think one of the things that I think people would be really surprised, having ridden horses at that level, and I've catch rode, so I know what it was to develop my own horse to the Grand Prix, but having catch rode multi-million-dollar horses at the stable I was at, I think one of the things that people would be surprised is not just the roll cur, but the amount of weight in a horse's mouth that's in your hands. So I would say, like, most people are saying that like 5 pounds, 10 pounds in a horse's hands. We're talking 30 to 50 in your hands. Like, you are literally water skiing for life up there. And that's how much they want them in the hand because they're pushing so much from behind. It's not a balance, it's water skiing. And I think that's where, people get stuck on the roll cur piece a little bit, but you can put a horse up in a frame and still be doing significant amounts of damage to their tongue and to their lips and to their vertebrae because of the amount of weight that is in your hand and how vicious those bits are. And so I think it's easy for people to understand the concept of roll cur, but the concept of what's being done to these horses when they have the tight nose bands and the blue tongues and they can't breathe is equally as damaging. And so the narrative is like, well, the horse isn't in roll cur, but like the horse still can't breathe. So I think that's one of the big shifts that we kind of need to start to see as well, as people understanding the next piece of it.
Yeah, like how much pulling there is even when the horse isn't super overbent. That's really interesting what you said though, with the amount of weight in your hands, because I think a lot of people who haven't ridden horses at that level would just assume that they would be really light in the mouth and that you wouldn't be having that much weight, just because like that's the vision that a lot of people are sold, is that like upper level dressage is the epitome of lightness and harmony and softness.
And I had this conversation with a friend who I said, I probably wouldn't have known that if I hadn't ridden those horses either, right? Like, people look at Lottie Fry and they're like, oh, it's so light. And in my head, I can't see it because I know what that feels like in your hand. And I think that's one of those cases that until you feel it, I don't think there's a way to know how horrific that feels in your hand.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And like visibly, it's hard because some people could argue that even if they notice that there is some pulling going on, they could say that it's just the rider pulling, which, I mean, even if the horse is leaning on them, it's caused by the rider due to the training program. But there'd be this idea where like, oh, if the rider would just let up on the reins, the horse would be soft. But when in reality, it sounds like if they're that heavy in the bridle already, if you just were to drop your hands, they just fall forward on the forehand.
Yeah, there would be no way to keep that horse together. There absolutely no way that horse would just fall onto its forehand. It would take years of retraining that horse into lightness. But if you did that, they would lose that crazy trot that everybody's going for, or the crazy movement that the electric piece, the energy. And so I think that's the biggest issue, is we're still seeing that chaos in the legs normalized, and everything else is lip service to chaos.
I think you saying circus tricks is really on point because that's what it looks like. And I've also seen some people compare it to saddle seat as well, which honestly, it's looking very similar. Like, I grew up showing Arabians, so there was a lot of saddle seat horses. And from what, like, you mentioned the elastic devices that they'll put on the front legs for like resistance training, and they're really common in the saddle seat world. And I didn't even consider the idea of dressage people using them, but it totally makes sense because to create that big movement up front, that's what the saddle seat people are using. Like, other than that, they can also use certain types of shoeing devices that are not legal in dressage. But I hadn't even considered the possibility of people in modern dressage using the very same things, but it makes sense.
Yeah, and I actually learned about it because I said to a friend, I knew she came from the saddle seat world too. And I said to her, I said, what are they doing to this horse? Because the movement from the horse was so wild to me. And then she took me down the rabbit hole. She was like, here's the things that there are. Here's the options, right? Here's what they could be doing. Here's what this looks like. And that's when I kind of started watching the saddle seat people, those videos. And at least they're open about it, right? Like, if you're going to do those things and you think without a question of a doubt that those are ethical, then put it on your story, right? Like, tell us who you are. And so when she showed me all of that, that opened a whole different door and a rabbit hole for me to see and what I suspected was happening. But like you, I never even dreamed that it was happening in dressage barns, because I haven't seen the bungees used in barns that I was in. But I've talked to a lot of people that are like, yeah, oh yeah, they're super common. And the fact that they're like, it's super common blows my mind because I haven't seen it. But I've been in just such a different world. So yeah, it's wild to hear that people have normalized it in dressage.
And then another thing that you've mentioned too before was like nerving ears and tails. Would you be able to talk a little bit about that? Because I think that's another one that people who aren't really fully immersed in the know, they might notice certain aspects of tests where they go, oh, that's a little weird that the horse isn't having very much movement there, but they are less likely to have their mind go immediately to that because it's just such an awful practice. And I think a lot of people try to give people the benefit of the doubt.
So one of my favorite things about being in Florida is there's so many different disciplines and so many different cultures of horse people. And so I have some friends who are at the very top of the quarter horse world. And I took them to a dressage show last year. And we walked out to one of the rings that was doing a national level Grand Prix. And it was a relatively big name person in the ring. And I'm just watching away doing my thing. And she's like, oh, that horse has its ears nerved. And it was a better example than the one that I used, because in the bonnet, it kind of keeps their horse in a shape. But the horse's ears were literally like flopped a little bit down and to the sides. And then if the horse moved, I mean, the ears would either pop up based on the head or come down based on the head. But the ears were definitely nerved. There was no, once you see it, you can't unsee it. And I literally had my jaw dropped the rest of the test because I was like, what? And it was like, I think for most people, not something that I had ever even thought people were doing. And here we go. We've got this happening from a big name person at a national level show. So I started watching and seeing it more and more as a trend. A lot of the Helgestrand type horses, or that have come aligned with Helgestrand, that school, that camp, a lot of them have it done. And same thing, watching the tails. So that was that piece, and that's where I came across that piece. And I've been watching it, and it's not uncommon in the dressage world. But the tails, a lot of people argue that the weighted tails are what's stopping the tail movement. But what really flagged me on the tails last year was Lottie Fry came out for only 2 shows, and the tail was braided. And that's just so, and for me, it's a lot about pattern recognition with these horses. Like, okay, if it doesn't do something once, that's fine. Or if it does something twice, but then when you start to look at the patterns. And so for her to have the tail braided twice, what did they do to the horse's tail? Right? Why is the horse's tail not moving all of a sudden? So again, people argue that it could be weighted. I've talked to vets in depth, and there is a possibility that they can nerve the tail in one way so it doesn't go left, right, but can move up. So there's people who can talk in depth as to what the science behind what they're doing looks like. But all I know is that people from the quarter horse world, is pretty common practice in their world. And when they come out and they look at the horse and they're like, oh, that horse has its ears nerved, and it's such a casual conversation for them, and my jaw drops, that's something that I should be watching for, right? So I think both of those, we're so naive in our little bubble of dressage because we always think that people are doing the best for their horses, or we'd like to think they're doing their best for the horses, that when you start talking to people from other disciplines and understanding what people are willing to go through, I think it's just a matter of time before more and more of this gets exposed.
Yeah, I think that if there is a big expose, it's going to be really bad for all horse sports, because I think that a lot of people try to remain in the little bubble of denial where they'll go, these are high caliber performance horses. They're worth hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. These people would never do XYZ because this is such a valuable horse. They get the best of the best care. They live like royalty. And there's this mindset that just because their owners are wealthy and that there's a lot of access to high-end care, that it's automatically the best care, when really a lot of those horses are lacking some of their most basic and crucial needs. And that's a paradigm shift that I think needs to happen in the horse world too, where people stop maintaining the perspective that just because someone has money and access, that it means that they're actually providing the best of the best care. Because from what I've seen is like, they'll put a lot of money into vet care and stuff to keep the horse in competition, but sometimes it's to the horse's detriment, where they're injecting the shit out of their joints and continuing to work them at a level where, if your horse is so arthritic or so unsound that they need corticosteroid injections all the time in like multiple different joints to compete at the pinnacle of the sport, it begs the question of whether or not it's ethical to be keeping them at that level if their only way they can maintain it is with numbing so many different areas of their body. And then, of course, there's the stable management argument, too, where a lot of these horses are stalled 24/7. And occasionally you'll get a video from an upper level rider where they'll show them bringing their horse out to be turned out and talking about the turnout process. And they'll never say how long they're out there. But I find a big tell for that for me is like, if the horse is wearing boots on all four legs and is just like bubble wrapped, they can't leave them out in the sun for very long because they're literally cooking the tendons. And that's a really normal thing where it's like, as soon as a horse is worth a certain amount of money, that's just like, oh, well, they need to be bubble wrapped and kept in a stall most of the time because this is a high-end sport horse.
Yeah, and it's an interesting piece of that. So I think with the vet stuff, there's horses in Wellington at the top who see a vet every day just to be able to be competing.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so, it's so funny how I find things out, because I'll call things out. Sometimes I'm like, hey, that horse shouldn't be competing. And someone's like, hey, that horse sees a vet every day, right? And you're like, oh, well, that doesn't surprise me. So yeah, but it's exactly the question is, if it's taking that much to patch the horse together just to compete, does it need to be competing the Grand Prix, right? Like, especially when it's people who have so much disposable income that you can go buy another Grand Prix horse. Like, why are you, to the detriment of this horse that you supposedly love, patchwork quilting it together for entertainment purposes, right? Like, that's the wild part to me, is that, and again, it's all the things. Wellington is not a really horse hospitable place. It's hot. There's diseases in the sand. There's sand colic. It's not the. It's buggy. It's a swamp. It's miserable for horses. So just taking them there for entertainment value is one thing, but then like the lack of ability to be able to turn them out and do all those things is a whole nother tier of when these horses go to Wellington. And then there's horses that are there full year round. So yeah, I think the problem is at the top is everybody loves their horse, but I think everybody loves their horse differently.
Yeah, I find that some of the love that people talk about, it's more about what the horse can do for them in the competition ring. Like, I saw a quote somewhere that was like, some people love riding and some people love horses. And I think that's a really great way of looking at it, because it's pretty easy to tell when riding is being prioritized more, because those people are the ones that are pawning their dead lame horses off on other people and then going and buying a new horse to compete with and doing stuff where the horse suddenly loses value to them when it's no longer rideable, or they're willing to push them to compete at any cost. And then it really exposes like where the priorities lie. And I say this as someone who used to love riding more than horses, because I would make decisions that were in line with that. And at the time I would have argued with anyone who would say that to me, and I would deny that that was the case. But it's true. You have to look at your actions. If you're prioritizing riding above the well-being of your horse, you do love riding more than the horse.
Absolutely. And I think I was one of those people too, right? Like I thought if you worked hard and sacrificed everything, you could get there, right? We were all sold that dream. And then I think once you step back and realize that the dream is not real, it's easier to prioritize your horse and say, okay, I'm not going to buy into this system because it's a joke anyway. So how do I make my horse happy and enjoy that partnership and enjoy the journey rather than just the outcome? So I think we all kind of fell down that rabbit hole at one point where we enjoyed the riding piece and the winning piece differently.
Oh, for sure. And I think that enjoying the journey is huge because if you're constantly focused on just the destination, realistically, even when you are succeeding and you're at the top of the level, there's always a new destination where it's like, okay, well, now we've qualified for this show. The next move is to go here or to beat this score or to get used to this new partnership with a new horse. And it's like, I feel like one of the problems with those riders is that they can never fully be satisfied because they're constantly seeking gratification that stems from like how people perceive them and they're riding the scores they get. And none of it is really about how they show up for their horse. There's really little focus on like the actual horse rider partnership, even though like I think the FEI tries to market that really heavily where they'll be like the horse human bond. It's so beautiful. But if you actually look at what those riders are doing with those horses outside of the competition ring, they don't really have a bond because if all you're doing is getting handed your horse by a groom and getting on them and then like what you said, water skiing around the arena, if anything, the horse is going to see you coming and be like, oh God, here we go again. This is so and so. And I remember how they make me feel. But if you're never doing anything that the horse actually likes or finds valuable, how can you build that bond? Because horses and like this is probably going to rub some people the wrong way, but like horses don't develop bonds with people solely from riding. Like they don't have someone climb on their back and go, wow, we're so connected now, we're friends. That's not how it works for them. Like there has to be more than just that.
Yeah, I think the FEI has done a lot of work this year in terms of trying to show off that bond. They have diligently, we saw at the Olympics all the photos of like the patting my horse and the heart me, and they're standing around hand walking their horse or hand grazing their horse. I've never seen so many riders hand graze their horses. I was astounded, right? Because usually it's the grooms doing that, right? The riders are off somewhere else. So the FEI has never worked harder at trying to position that partnership and that love and all the little hand hearts everywhere. So I thought it was hilarious this year when they tried to really position that welfare and partnership piece.
Yeah, the Olympics were kind of a shit show. I thought that they were going to do a little bit more work to at least try to not like make it as blatant because some of the tests that were scoring really high and like the images that photographers got, it surprised me because I thought that they would have taken it a little bit more seriously, just how riled up people have been getting about horse welfare. Because I do personally feel like we're at a major turning point where if something doesn't change soon, that welfare advocacy is going to win and horse sports are going to eventually end up getting fully phased out because everyone outside of the horse world sees it pretty plainly for what it is. And they have they haven't been brainwashed to the same degree. Was I muted that whole time?
No,
Or did
no,
you hear?
you just,
Okay, cool.
it kind of lagged. That's
Okay.
all. Yeah.
Yeah, and they haven't been brainwashed to the same degree. So they see these things plainly for what they are and they're outraged by them. And then you also have people within the horse community who are seeing these things. So then they have the solidarity of everyone else. And like I think what a lot of horse people are missing out on is that overall, like our community is pretty small. People outside of horse sports don't really give a shit about watching our horse sports. It's not a big pull for viewership. There's some big name sponsors and there's a lot of money in the industry, but if there becomes enough unrest about the welfare of the horses and there's nothing being done to fix it, I think that it's going to start collapsing. And I think that the collapse has already started in some ways in that we're seeing less and less people prioritizing climbing up the levels because of how inaccessible it's become and also the welfare implications. But I feel like we're at a turning point where if we don't make big changes within the next couple of years, that there's going to be even more pressure and it's going to hit the point where if we haven't made enough changes, like people aren't going to believe that the change is going to come. And then at that point, it doesn't matter what the FEI does to try to change the paradigm and be like, hey, we care now.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I read an article and I thought it was really interesting. And they said in most horse sports, if someone sees like the abuse makes them uncomfortable, they'll usually pivot and go to a different discipline, right? They're like, hey, I'm not so cool with this. I'm going to go try something else. But within dressage, this is the first time we have seen the uprise from within the sport. It's the athletes within the sport that are saying, this is so horrific that it needs to stop. And so I think that says everything. And all it's going to take is for the sweep of the animal welfare advocates outside of that bubble to make the movement. And then you're right. It's going to be too late for the FEI to make those changes, right? Like right now, they're like, oh, we'll give you a noseband measuring device when like they need a complete overhaul.
Yeah, and I think also it's like gotten so bad that the noseband device is like nice, but it's almost impractical because I really highly doubt that stewards are going to be measuring every noseband like in the war up ring, and then also like as the horses enter the arena, and like just how often they would need to check to actually manage the misuse of nosebands would be so excessive at this point that it has to be more than that, because also there's a reason why they're tightening the nosebands, and it's because it's working to hide behaviors that would potentially get them marked down. So the judges also just need to be judging differently so that there's not really the same pressure, or like I guess manufactured pressure to make people want to use their tack in that way.
Yeah, I agree. It's putting lipstick on the pig, I think is the expression, right? Like it's like, we'll give you this cute little device, but it's not going to solve the problem.
Yeah, and it's ridiculous. Like some of the nosebands that I've seen, it's like in the photos, you can literally see the blood vessels filling from either side of the noseband because of how tight it is. It's like a tourniquet on the face. And yet, even still, like I've taken photos like that. I think the craziest thing for me within this whole like dynamic.
Oh, you're cutting.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
I think the craziest thing with me with the whole dynamic between welfare advocacy and people within the sport is how you can get these photos that depict such a blatantly clear abuse of the horse, and you'll still get people defending it and being like, that's fine, like you've never competed at that level. Because I try to select photos that are so blatantly awful that people will have a hard time arguing why they're okay. And depending on who the rider is, you still get people defending it, even when it's a photo of like a very clearly misfitted piece of tack, or the tongue is blue, or something along those lines, and people still defend it. And I think that is one of the most disheartening things about being involved in advocacy, is because with the upper level riders, I kind of expect them not to care, but everyone who's willing to defend them, even in photos that should not be defensible, that's one of the hardest parts for me with regards to continuing to have hope for the sport.
Yeah, I agree. I had that moment yesterday when someone tried to say that Charlotte Dujardin did not hit the horse in that video. And I was like, what? She admitted it. The FBI has admitted it. And we're just going to full on gaslight the world into trying to say that it didn't happen. And those are the moments that you have pause, because you're like, of all the work that you and I and a whole lot of other people are doing right now, and then you get someone who's so indoctrinated into the establishment that they're in such complete denial of fact. You're like, how do we, first of all, how did we get here? But how do we access those people? Because clearly the message is so opposite of what they're seeing. I don't even know. Like that's the part I think that becomes frustrating and disappointing in all the years of advocacy, of saying, okay, like it's never been more clear, right? Like you're pulling videos that are very clear. The abuse videos are always very clear, right? It's so clear what's happening, and people are still, it makes them so uncomfortable. They're still happily denying it.
Yeah, I think part of it is like when you grow up, like I started riding really young, and when you're being indoctrinated into it from a young age, you've at the time you hit like adulthood and you're more able to critically think, you've dedicated like 20 years of your life being indoctrinated into seeing things a certain way, and then having to look at the way they actually are means unpacking all of those years and these people that you loved and supported and what they taught you to do and the horses that you've hurt. So it definitely sucks. Like as someone who's done that, it's not fun. It's not a good time, but at the same time, sinking into it and just being like, I'm going to double down and keep believing this, all you're doing is signing up for like a worse realization way later in life if you ever decide to have that change of heart. Or you maintain your position, but it's like deep down, the reason why you're getting so upset and triggered by people pointing these things out is because you know that they're correct. And there's a part of you that's still fighting it and that you feel uncomfortable, and you're never fully going to be comfortable. So it's kind of like choose your battle. Do you want to deal with the discomfort of gaslighting yourself and lying to yourself for the rest of your life? Or do you want to deal with the discomfort of admitting where you went wrong and making necessary changes?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's like a big shift we're seeing in the industry right now. I think we've all sort of done things that we maybe don't agree with, or we have had trainers where I was 16 the first time I pulled the reins away from my trainer for beating my horse. And I was like, packed up my horse and I left.
That's very brave.
And
That's younger than most people, I would say, because it's so hard to do.
yeah, and I was just a sassy teenager, and I literally packed up my horse, put it on a trailer, and pulled my horse out of training. And the trainer actually called my mom to say she needs to bring the horse back, and my mom was brave enough to be like, "Well, that's between you and her." And so I think we've all been in situations where we wish we hadn't have been, or we've all done things that maybe wish we hadn't have done. But I think the evolution that needs to happen is like that piece where you have to be okay with like making peace with that and saying, I'm going to do better. We know better, we do better. And then moving forward instead of like doubling down and digging deeper and be like, no, it's totally normal.
For sure. I think like a lot of trainers teach their students through a shame-based mindset too, where if you screw up, they can make you feel really badly about yourself. And I think that's the lens some people are coming through. But I've found overwhelmingly that if you're willing to admit where you went wrong, most people are willing to accept that and acknowledge your mistake and take you at your your present and future behavior instead of clinging to like who you were in the past. And I think the more safety that's created in that, the more people will realize that it actually is very reinforcing to that something was wrong, because it frees you from the burden of having to deal with that guilt just on your own. Because now you're with a community of people who have all made similar mistakes and moved on from them. And like, there's a lot of stuff I regret doing to my horses that was really unfair, because like there is horrendous abuse that I grew up with in the Arabian circuit as well. A lot of it's very similar to what they do in dressage with over tightening the nose bands, like blue tongue, spur marks, whatever, like beating the shit out of horses when they don't listen. And that's what I grew up seeing and having normalized to me. And I didn't really have any ways of problem solving unwanted behaviors without resorting to punishment that wasn't fair to the horse. And it's something that I regret. And obviously, I wish that things were different growing up, because I would have ended up being a very different rider if I'd had access to better mentorship. But you can't change the past. So I think the big thing for people going forward is just to realize that it's better to admit that you were wrong as early as you're able to than it is to continue maintaining a delusion for far too long. And it also inspires other people to do the same. Like, I think it's really great that you talk about the level that you competed at and what it was like, and then use that to be like, okay, here's why I don't like the way things are continuing to go in modern dressage, because it just normalizes the idea that you can both love and appreciate a sport and have participated in it, but then also recognize the problems in it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, so many people are like, oh, you're out to destroy dressage. And that's not what I'm out to do. I'm passionate about the sport too. I love the sport. I mean, I obviously grew up in it. I put a lot of hours and time, and I'm very passionate about it. So the goal is not to end it, right? I don't think any of us wants to end equestrian sports. I think we want to evolve equestrian sports into something better or more sustainable.
Oh, for sure. And I think where people get confused with that is that if the sport were to refuse to change and if it's just going to stay how it is, then it's like that's where people would be like, well, I would rather not have to witness the abuse at this level and have the sport go away than have to continue dealing with this just to have it be there. But I think the important thing is that that's not wanting to end the sport. It's loving the sport enough to believe in people's capacity to evolve and do better and be more ethical, and also setting a standard where it's like, I don't want to accept really like archaic level of mistreatment to the horses that we know better now, and we could be using modern information to change. And I think that people's lack of ability to view that nuance is a big problem, because it shouldn't just be that if you love the sport, you have to accept it as is and defend everything in it, or you don't love it enough. I don't think that supporting toxicity is an indicator of love. I think it's the opposite, actually.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And that's what the establishment has really built its success on. And I think the only way to change that is to disrupt the establishment.
Oh, for sure. And like make them start to lose money and sponsors or support, because I think the biggest thing for the FEI, it's not going to really be appealing to their ethics, because I don't really think they have any. I think it's going to be appealing to the fact that their profit margins and their ability to continue functioning as an organization is going to be impacted if they don't make the changes.
Yeah. And I think they recognize that they are in a bit of a crisis right now. I think for them by this point, I would assume that they probably have a lot of videos of a lot of riders at the top. And I think whether they decide to publish those or do something about those, though, that's going to be their ethical conundrum in the next 12 months. But I suspect they're starting to get the scope of how big and vast the problem is.
I hope so. And I hope we'll start to see big shifts, because already within the last year, there's the shifts that certain governing organizations by country, like Denmark, making changes to the regulations with regards to riding bitless or riding in a snaffle and dressage. That's a great shift, and it would be nice to see more places doing that. So I think that more people are catching on. I did want to ask you about the federation that you've founded, and just if you could tell people more about that.
So the World Equestrian Federation is basically, the goal is to compete with all of the international or the national level organizations, but in a place where you can compete with an actual mindset for welfare first. So there's 3 pillars to it, where we have education, community, and competition. So the goal is to build a global community of people that you can network with, that we were talking about a little bit before when you said, once you've admitted that you'd want to change, there's always a soft place to land. Education, so working with people who are experts in sort of the science and on top of some of the science and things like that, in terms of whether that's fitting a bitless bridle or, those kinds of things. So evolving your education in terms of a welfare first perspective. And then a competition where there'll be shows where we're going to work on sanctioning some, but currently they're online, where you can compete bitless. If you need a rule change, you basically just submit that you need this rule change. Like, you're going to compete bitless, but you're going to do this test. So it allows you the options to compete in the rules in a way that works for you and your horse. So the goal is to really create an organization. I think people are frustrated with the current organizations because they're not advocating for the horses, even though they're saying they are. And I think that people are frustrated with giving their money to an organization that doesn't really offer them the opportunity to, one, compete fairly and ethically, and it also doesn't allow them the opportunity to support an organization that's supporting horses. So the goal is to create something and people to still feel that they compete, they can still feel valuable and still have like a sense of community that's provided by an organization that way. So yeah, it's a big undertaking. But the goal is to really create something that people can compete around the world and have some fun really connecting as a community.
I think that's a great idea, because I think that having more choices outside of like USEF, Equestrian Canada, and the like FEI sanctioned shows is so important, because basically all of those major organizations follow the same rule book for everything for the most part. So I think that having something that's more flexible, because like you were saying with like changing rules, or you can like write in to get like an exception for whatever, like it would be such a simple change in theory, where if like even for dressage with bitless being like, hey, my horse has dental issues and I can't put a bit in their mouth, can I compete bitless? They should be able to still get judged the same way, because people are getting stuck on like the term being on the bit and whatnot, when really it's just relating to how the horse is on your contact. And it's a very small change in wording to really just change the entire concept. But people are so anti-change that it'll be nice to have organizations around that start to show, hey, like, we've altered these things, and look, the competition and like the general structure of the actual discipline has not changed, but the horses are happier, and look, it's working. It's not more unsafe when riders are riding bitless. We're not seeing more problems. In fact, we're seeing less because the horses are stressed less. I think that'll be really important because it just gives riders more access to organizations that are going to be actually advocating for horses more.
Yeah. And I think that's really what people are frustrated with is people are frustrated with the orgs. So I wanted to create an opportunity and a place for people to not support toxic orgs and to create a sense of community. And I think that's really the goal is to kind of create that and give you a place where like, and maybe it's your horse needs to be medicated on something that's a banned substance. I don't know what an example of that is. You know, like those kinds of things, we're allowing the space for that, right? To say, okay, like, let's talk about this, right? Like sometimes it's an ointment, right? All these FEI riders, they love to be like, oh, it was the dog, right? But okay, let's allow the space for that. If your horse has like a little bit of a cut and you need to use something 4 days before a show, let's revisit some of these rules in terms of like what's going to be better for horses. And I'm not saying that like that's probably a bad example of it, but I want to open the door to revisit some of the rules in terms of welfare first, because I think the rules have always been created in terms of org first and competition first. So what happens if
Sure.
we shift those rules and revisit them? So again, big undertaking in terms of looking at a lot of the things that are in place.
Oh yeah, yeah, I'm sure that it's huge. There's so many different variables for getting that started, but like good for you for doing it because I think that the like huge undertaking that is to create that puts so many people off of even imagining that that's a possibility. So all it takes is like one person to get that started and then it can bring really meaningful change. Because yeah, like with what you were saying about banned substances, I'm pretty sure I know Equestrian Canada and USEF, so I'd assume FEI too. They banned CBD as like a treatment for like as a for like competition horses can't be on CBD supplements, despite the fact that for like general anxiety and stuff, it can be really beneficial, or as like a far less invasive painkiller for horses who have like arthritis or other forms of chronic pain. It could be a solution that's less invasive than getting joint injections or having them on bute and stuff. And that's one where I know that there's a big uproar when it did get banned because people were pretty upset. So there's things that I think if you revisited them from the perspective of looking at all the information surrounding it, that it would be about actually protecting the horses because there's a lot of banned things that the FBI has and they say it's for the horse, but then it doesn't actually align with other things that they're allowing that are damaging to the horse.
Yeah. And I think a lot of their drug mandates or whoever lobbied for a substance to be on or off the list, but that's a whole nother discussion.
Oh yeah, for sure. No, that's great though. It's a lot of great information and then it gives people the chance to check out your organization if they want to compete. Cause also like online shows are way more accessible for a lot of people too. And I think that in itself being an option makes it so that people can prepare their horses better because they can compete from home first. And like for anyone with show nerves and whatnot, that's way more accessible too. So I think that moving into something like that is fantastic. And hopefully it'll start to create more of an environment where people are surrounded by a community of people who are influenced by doing the right things and then normalizing that aspect of things so that there's so much less pressure off of being successful in competition. Because I also think the pressure to prove yourself in the competition ring can lead to a lot of mistreatment towards the horse because you feel like you have to keep up with everyone else around you. And that's one of the toxic parts of the horse show industry that doesn't, it's not just about the horses, it also really negatively impacts people and can create a lot of toxic issues amongst people.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's one of the components there.
Well, thank you for coming on to talk to me. That's really great because I love your posts and I love what you're doing. And I think that the way you go about it in like a no bullshit, no nonsense kind of way is not always what people want to hear, but it's kind of what they need to hear because a lot of people have been walking on eggshells around these issues for a lot of years and trying to kind of keep the peace to a degree where they miss out on really important aspects of conversation that I think you're touching on. And even if not everyone wants to hear it, it's still a voice that's putting information out there that needs to be heard in some capacity. And then people can just take it or leave it and do whatever they want with it.
Yeah, and it's been great finally meeting you in person, I guess, or sort of in person, face to face, and being able to connect with you because again, I've been a big fan of yours for a long time and kind of watching everything that you do and supporting a lot of it. So yeah, it's
I
great to finally
appreciate it. I
connect.
feel the
Yeah.
same way. And my grandma lives in Florida, so she's actually wanted to take me to one of the big horse show facilities there if I come visit. So if I'm ever in the area, I'll shoot you a message. I don't know where, like I think she's closer to Wellington because the World Equestrian Center is in Ocala, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
okay, yeah, I think she's closer to Wellington, but yeah, I'd want to go to both of them and just see what it's all about because I think it would be a really interesting environment. Even just the sheer amount of wealth involved to like participate in that area of showing, I think would be interesting to see. So definitely if I'm in the area, I would love to come check out those places.
Yeah, I go back and forth between the two. So I'd love to connect and show you behind the scenes but it's definitely an eye-opening experience to see
Oh,
the
I
horse
bet.
world in Florida.
Yeah, no, I'd love to. I'll let you know if I'm in the area. And yeah, thank you so much for coming on. That was a lovely chat.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Making Milestones podcast this week. If you are interested in ways that you can help support the podcast, it would be greatly appreciated if you would leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Reviews help to promote the podcast in the algorithm, allowing me to connect with new listeners, and it is so greatly appreciated. Some other ways you can help to support the podcast include subscribing to my Patreon channel, where you can subscribe for as little as $1 a month and access monthly Q&As, behind-the-scenes content, training help, and more. Every subscription helps, and they help to offset any costs associated with the podcast, allowing me to keep most of these episodes ad-free. I also have an online store where I sell equestrian athletic apparel, graphic t-shirt and hoodie designs, horse bridles, both bitted and bitless, and you can check that out in the podcast description as well. Lastly, I have my main website where I have a bunch of webinars with different types of training topics and where I also offer online training consultations if you want a one-on-one appointment with me. All of this helps me continue doing what I'm doing, and your support is so appreciated.